thanks for showing up in the snow. As a token of appreciation, remember what I told you a couple of weeks ago about NIMBYism and bananas, what they stand for. I'll kind of mix that in different questions. So in the context of this course, NIMBYism means not in my backyard, and bananas don't build anything anywhere. So I expect that in a question on agriculture, and this will just be thrown as a curveball to confuse your colleagues. This being said, I will delete most of the questions in the first part related to the first part of the course in the coming days, and so don't panic. You won't have that many questions to prepare for the final exam. Okay, so today's lecture is about agriculture, and normally as a faculty I'm supposed to be as unbiased and professional as I can be. I don't know to what level I succeed, but as far as agriculture is concerned, it's kind of hard for me to be objective, at least in as much as my positions are out there and are reasonably well known. So this is my most famous book, in which I was sort of critical of the whole local food movement that you've heard so much these last few years. So I believe that there are such things as economies of scales and benefits of a broader division of labor in agricultural production as with everything else. And so it's kind of easy for you to find my writings on the topic because I made an effort to reach out to a broader audience. Okay, so with this out of the way, let's try to cover what I believe are the most salient points made by the authors in their chapter on agricultural production. So as is typical in their approach, they want to cover a lot of material, but I will again emphasize a few issues and tell you what really matters. One thing which I will discuss, not in mathematical depth, but at least to some extent, is the von Thunen's land rent model. So more on that in a few minutes, but this is something of a staple of economic geography, and if you want to understand how historically food production was organized in the countryside the world over, this is a good starting point. It also helps you understand how 2 centuries ago economic considerations played a role in terms of what kind of agricultural activities were located where. And so you can almost certainly expect a question on that in the final exam. I'll then discuss food securities, government subsidies, alternatives to industrialized agriculture, where again my own biases are kind of reasonably well known. Okay, so that's a lot of information here, but the point is that until the whole local food fad movement began maybe 10, 15 years ago, it was generally understood by most people that agriculture is influenced more than any other industry by natural conditions, by physical geography, and that some places on earth are simply better than others at producing certain kinds of things, and that therefore they should specialize in what they do best and trade these materials or these food items over long distances with other people. It was also well understood that farms are like any other businesses. The bigger they are, the more efficient they tend to become. I mean, all farms started small. The ones that grew were the one in which their owners were the most innovative, the one that were better able to adapt to changing market conditions, to adopt new crops. And so as with any other businesses, well, some were more successful than others, and a number of farmers grew their operations by buying their neighbor's operation that might not have been as efficient as theirs. And so, again, whether you're producing pineapples or potatoes, there are often significant economies of scale in growing your operation, just as it wouldn't make sense to have 10,000 car manufacturers, and as a result, we have a few of them who are fairly large and who absorb their competitors over time. So, what determines the location of agricultural productions in a free market / globalized economy? Well, first of all, you've got different types of soil. Some have more clay than others, some are sandier than others. Some are easily eroded. In other parts of the world, the topsoil is a few meters thick. And so not all parts of the earth have the same type of soil, and obviously not all types of crops grow as well as other types of crops in certain types of soil. You can grow potatoes in almost any environment, but some other crops, corn for example, require very good conditions. And so the world, it was not created equal in that respect. Some parts of the world are fairly flat, others might be flat but have poor quality soils. Others are mountainous, and so again, you've got different types of soil the world over. And then you've got different types of climates. Obviously, some parts of the world are cooler or drier or wetter than others, and so even though you might have two parts of the world that have similar soil conditions, one might be in the tropics, where you have a dry and a wet season. Another might be in a temperate climate in which you have 4 seasons. In some parts of the world, you might have a longer growing season than others. In other parts of the world, the rain might be concentrated for a few months each year. And so again, you might have similar soil conditions, but the climate might differ between locations. And obviously, some types of crops will grow better in one type of environment than another. And then other parts of the world get a lot more precipitation than others. So it might be that, for example, in a location like Arizona, you've got flat terrain, you've got very rich soil, but you're in the middle of a desert. Now, you might be able to divert rivers or to dig very deep in the ground to access water sources, in which case growing food in a desert might make a lot of sense if you're able to procure water economically. But in other parts of the world, there's not enough rain, or there might be too much rain. There is such a thing as too much rain for certain types of crops. Wheat, for example, does not do well when you've got too much rain. It tends to rot. It might be more susceptible to rust problem, which is a common problem historically with wheat production. And so again, having a drier climate might be more suitable to some types of cereal grains. Having a lot of rain might be useful for growing other types of crops. And so even though this one is an overgeneralization, it turns out that some parts of the world are just better suited for agriculture than other parts of the world. So if you look here at the sub-Saharan belt here in Africa, it's very suitable to grow a lot of stuff, but you see a big empty space over there. And why is that? Well, because as I just told you, this is the Sahara Desert. You've got the Gobi Desert out here, you've got very arid condition in the southwest United States. You've got probably the driest, most arid part on Earth here, the Atacama Desert. Most of Australia is unsuitable for human population and obviously for agricultural production. And so there are only a few areas the world over that are really suitable to agricultural productions. Not surprisingly, they tend to be the most populated. So you can see that India and China, for example, have a lot of very good agricultural land. Not surprisingly, they're by far the most populated countries on Earth. But at the same time, you've got to understand that while it is technically possible to grow wheat in Saudi Arabia, for example, which was tried a couple of decades ago, you can take water from the sea, remove the salt out of it, and use it to irrigate wheat crops. It just doesn't make sense, even for a rich country like Saudi Arabia, to spend money growing stuff in horrible conditions. It makes more sense to spend the money that you would spend removing the salt from seawater to just import wheat from other locations, like Turkey, for example, which have very good growing conditions. Okay, so this is roughly what the agricultural map of the world looks like. So there are a number of tropical areas which are not really developed, although a more recent map here would show you an extension of the soybean belt in Brazil. But you can see that in many parts of the world, you've got extensive cropping system and intensive cropping systems. The red areas are areas in which people produce a lot of food and produce it very intensively. brownish areas, extensive cropping system, typically where you don't have access to irrigation water, and so on and so forth. So a number of natural conditions, state of economic development, history of agricultural development in regions, all of these things do matter and make some parts of the world more suitable to food production than others. Now this is the map you have in the textbook. Black and white, I don't like it too much, it's a bit too complex, but you can see that, for example, in places like China, you really have two different types of agriculture. So people grow wheat in the north, that's a bit of an oversimplification, but roughly that's what they do. And in the south, they tend to grow rice. In the United States, you've got the corn/soybean belt in some parts of the US, you've got livestock grazing in others, you've got tropical fruit production in places like Florida. And so again, people over time have specialized in growing the type of food that their region is best suited for. Now Canada is no different. We don't produce a lot of tobacco in southern Ontario, but we used to not too long ago. That's because these soils were very sandy, very suitable to tobacco production, not so much for other stuff, although these days alternatives have been found in those areas. Now, if you ever drive between southern Ontario and, let's say, the lower St. Lawrence region in Quebec, you will see a lot of dairying and livestock along the way. If you get off the highway, or in some parts of Quebec and Ontario, you'll see a number of dairy cows from along the highway. Out west, they produce a lot of beef cattle and grain. So beef cattle is the type of beef that you grow for meat, not for producing dairy products, and so on and so forth. Okay, don't worry about this. I'm not going to quiz you on that specific slide, but the point that the authors make in a nutshell is that agriculture has been around for maybe 8 or 10,000 years. At first, farmers only grew domesticated versions of what already existed in their area, and because transportation was very bad historically, they were selling mostly to local markets, if they were selling at all, but in many parts of the world, people practiced subsistence agriculture, which is to say that they mostly produced for their own families. And because people in a particular area would tend to produce the same thing as their neighbors, there wasn't much of an incentive to specialize and trade with other people. This incentive only really emerged with the development of cities and the capacity to move food over either long distances, especially through water transportation, or else by having producers being located very close or even within cities to supply local populations. So before the railroad and the steamship came along in the 19th century, by and large, farming in flat areas with a city tended to look something like what was theorized by a Prussian or East German fellow named von Thunen. So this is sort of what he looked like at one point in his life. Von Thunen was both a large-scale landowner who produced food and also somebody who was a reasonably good mathematician. And so in his spare time, apart from managing his estate, he tried to develop an economic/geographical approach to land use in places like Germany, which tended to be fairly flat and had a few small cities. So his model, in a tradition that would become more prominent in economics in later decades and the next 2 centuries, basically, made a few assumptions. So he assumed that the plain was flat and that people were self-interested, meaning that they acted according to their own interest. Farmers would try to maximize the value that they could create out of their land. What they could do, though, in this respect, was severely impacted by transportation cost. And because different types of productions competed over land use with other types of production, you saw a regular pattern emerge all over Europe and other developed parts of the world at the time, places like the United States, Japan, and the most prosperous parts of China. But von Thunen never traveled to those parts of the world, so what he really had in mind was kind of a flat plain in Germany. So what he developed was essentially this model here, and I will examine each of those separately, and I will ask you to remember what each belt consists of. Okay, if you can take a picture of this. This one is slightly different than the one in your textbook, but I believe that it is a better description of the von Thunen model than the one that you have in your textbook. So if I ask you to produce me a figure of the von Thunen model, this is the one I want, not the one in your textbook. So, you've got an urban center in the middle, and spontaneously through market interactions, and remember this is 1826, so not only no steamships, no railroad, but also no coal at the time. People were mostly using wood as fuel. This is the type of landscape that would emerge through voluntary / mutually beneficial market transactions. So in the middle you would have the city, because people had an incentive to pay good money to be close to other people who were not farmers. Immediately next to the city, and I will examine each of these belts in detail, you would have perishable food products, because it's not only that transportation sucked at the time, it did, but you also didn't have refrigeration. So milk, for example, if you cannot refrigerate it, really cannot travel and cannot be stored for a long time. Market gardening refers really to horticulture, so vegetable productions, among other things. Again, tomatoes, especially the varieties that were available at the time, would not travel long distances well, and they needed to be consumed right away. Now beyond that, you would have a belt that would be left in a forested state. Again, I'll tell you why. Beyond that, you would have grains and field crops, and beyond that, ranching and livestock. Okay, so in your question, I will ask you to reproduce this and then to explain each belt with a few words, and which is what I'm going to do right now. Okay? Okay, so imagine a city. This is not exactly a flat plain, but this is as close as it's gonna get. Okay, so this is the type of environment you have. This was painted in 1690. This is obviously a idealized countryside, but you can see that you've got the city, but you've got what seems to be a forested area here. You've got animals that are some distance from the city. You've got ships delivering material to the city, including some food items. And you've got things here that look like gardens. So again, it's not the perfect von Thunen model, but it tells you what was going on at the time. Okay, ring one. This is what I want you to remember. The people who will outbid other uses because they need to create a lot of value, and because they can command good prices for their products, are people who produce animals and products that either don't travel well or else can be fed or require organic waste. And by that I mean things like pigs. So pigs are very good to convert all sorts of organic waste into high quality proteins. I don't really discuss this in this class, but in my food class I describe, like in many cultures, you had people's bathroom at the back of their house, and you had the pigs right next to it so that you could feed human waste to pigs. This was very common historically. But you can also grow all sorts of vegetables because they do well in terms of growing into manure, into animal manure, or even human manure in a number of cultures. So moving animal manure or human waste over long distances is costly, it's not convenient, but for people who are very near the city, you can move the stuff and grow vegetables in there. And again, vegetables don't travel well, and they also benefit from organic waste. Okay, so things like eggs also would not travel well before refrigeration. It's amazing what we take for granted today, but again, if you want to consume fresh eggs, you need to consume them the same day, otherwise they won't last. or else they're likely to turn into something else. Okay, so this is a map of the city of London in 1798. So this is really where the people are. And all those yellow spots around here are dairy farms, or rather building in which you have dairy cows. And you feed a lot of organic waste to those dairy cows. So let's say you produce beer, you're left with something of spent grains, from which you extract beer, or you produce whiskey or something else. And you can feed that stuff along with grain that you can bring into the city to dairy animals. And so if you want to sell milk, well, it needs to be produced and sold the same day. And so people had an incentive to be very close to their markets. Now this is San Francisco in the 1880s. A lot of the market gardens around San Francisco were cultivated by Chinese migrants. I don't know if you can see the hat here. It's not all that well, but basically you have Chinese migrants producing food for the city of San Francisco. And again, this is not because there was something like a local food movement at the time. It's because if you wanted to consume fresh stuff, it needed to be produced close to customers. Now, in order to deal with less than ideal growing conditions, people historically developed all sorts of technologies, so greenhouses and cold frames, so little things here. What you want to do is protect flowers or other valuable crops from bad weather. Now today, of course, most greenhouses are made out of things like aluminum and plastic, but back in the days it was wood, bricks, and glass mostly. Again, local food was prevalent in a city like Paris. These are Les Jardins de Vaugirard. So if you ever go to Paris, there is a subway station called Vaugirard. Today, of course, it's fully developed, but a century and a half ago, you had a lot of market gardens in that area. So Paul Gauguin, you might know, is a famous painter, describes both the fact that there was a wall built around those gardens, and you can see someone producing all kinds of different crops around the city of Paris. This is another painting. This thing was still going on in 1921. You can see cloche here, so that's another way to defeat the elements. So what people would be doing, although in 1921 this was more problematic, there was a lot of horse manure produced in cities like Paris. So before the car came along, you had plenty of work horses in cities like Paris. Humans are strong, but nothing compared to a workhorse. And if you want the equivalent of a truck in those days, well, you need a big horse that will be able to pull a lot of weight. And so a lot of horses means a lot of animal feed that is shipped to the city, which means a lot of manure produced in the process. And so most of the vegetables that were produced in a place like Paris or any other large city at the time were produced in horse manure. Now these cloches protect whatever it is that you're growing from the elements, and they also trap CO2, which has been calculated to increase or to speed the rate of plant growth. So again, I don't want to bother you with the details, but today often a lot of CO2 is pushed into greenhouses to accelerate growth. In those days, while you had a lot of horse manure, you put a cloche on it, and plants would grow a bit faster that way. Now, of course, that sometimes during the day it would get too hot, so other implements were devised to keep the cloche open. This is what people used to do, move a lot of manure around in those systems. People also created dark straw mats. And they did all of that because that's how you would produce food year-round in a place like Paris. So if you look at the tree in the back there, all the leaves are gone. This is probably in winter there. It doesn't snow all that much in Paris, but it can get cold. So you see here another wall, and that's to cut the wind. These are wind-breaking walls. You can get a few additional degrees of heat, create a little microclimate around your garden. You've got your cloche, your horse manure, and during the daytime you put dark straw mats on top of that to capture more heat from the sun and increase the temperature in which you can grow stuff. And so you can actually produce stuff year-round in Paris over a century ago by using technologies like this. So I won't quiz you on that, but by the mid to late 19th century, so roughly 1850 to the late 1890s, roughly 1/6 of Paris is actually devoted to food production. 100 tons of produce each year. Everything is powered by horse manure in a way. But the people who have to deal with those technologies cannot simply just switch a button on and off. They need to work 18 to 20 hours a day during a busy season, and the rest of the year they take it easy, 14 to 16 hours a day. In the 1820s, they're first able to grow green asparagus year-round, and because these things don't travel over long distances and they can come at a good price, in the late 19th century they also produced a few pineapples around Paris. Now, this being said, it's not necessarily local food for local people, because if London customers pay more, these things will be shipped to London, those that can survive the stuff that can survive transportation to London. And unlike today, where a lot of local food activists tell you, well, we should learn to eat with the season, in those days people were very happy to have defeated seasonality. And this comes clearly in the writings of people in those days. So growing green asparagus year-round was viewed as something desirable, unlike today where people say, well, you should learn to eat with the seasons. Okay, so the system has been described as a local food system, but this is a bit misleading, at least in as much as the system is ultimately powered by animal feed that is shipped to the city to feed the horses, and then the system can be sustained that way, but without a lot of horse food being brought into the city, it would not have been as productive. Okay, so late 19th, early 20th century, you can see the kind of technologies that people develop. Again, this is around Paris. This was north of Paris. If you've ever been there, the city is here. There's the Seine River that comes from the south that goes north. Then there's an island here, which is where Paris was built. The area expands around it. And a lot of sewage then is shipped north. That's where nature will send it. And a number of gardens were created to recycle the sewage water back then. So this is a picture of people growing vegetables using sewage water. So again, a lot of people today think that they're very smart, they've thought of that, but no, people used to do that in the past and on a large scale. Okay, so again, this is Gennevilliers, north of Paris. The whole system is being irrigated, and a lot of sewage sludge is recycled in the process. If you go around Paris today, you can see a few leftovers from that area. But these are often areas in which a lot of public housing was built, so it's not always safe to go into some of these neighborhoods. But if you drive around, you will see abandoned buildings that are an echo, or at least that remind you of what this area was once devoted to, although not much food is produced these days there. Okay, back to Von Thunen. The second ring is timber and firewood. Again, this is because people don't have electricity, they don't have natural gas, they don't even burn coal on a large scale because wood burns more cleanly than coal. I mean, by the time Von Thunen writes, better burning coal burning stoves have been developed, but still people are in the habit of burning a lot of wood. And wood does not travel all that well, but it's very valuable. And so there is an incentive to maintain a forested belt around cities. Doesn't make sense to have it immediately next to the city because you can have more valuable things produced there, you know, eggs, dairy products, vegetables, rabbits, chickens, pigs. But wood is valuable enough and difficult enough to transport that people manage forest land around cities. Okay? So again, this is not some poor country today. This is the French countryside in the 1850s. So you can see people carrying a lot of firewood back to their houses. Okay, the third ring or the third belt is usually devoted to grain crops. Why is that? Well, grain can actually travel long distances. So if you have wheat, if you have barley, if you have rice, these things can be put in big bags and they can be stored for a long period of time. They can also be moved over long distances. But why aren't grain crops closer to the city than wood? It's because, well, wood is more difficult to transport. So grain crops are valuable enough to be produced close to the city, but not so valuable, and because they're easier to transport, not valuable enough to displace the forested belt around cities. Okay. Now, beyond that, you've got animals that can move on their own and that will eat forage, meaning whatever is around them. So unlike the horses in cities, which are fed grain crops often, which are brought from further away, beef cattle, so animals that are again raised for their meat, not for their milk, or things like goats and sheep, can eat whatever they find in that area and can then be led into the city, so they can travel, they can move on their own. So they're obviously easier to move than grain, and obviously much easier to move than wood. You just need a shepherd or someone who knows how to handle those animals, and you can drive them to the city when they're ready to be consumed. Okay, so sheep flocks, you take them to the pasture in the summer, then eventually you bring them back to the city. You might not have much in terms of transportation, you might not have refrigeration, but you can walk your animals back to the city and they'll be taken care of once they're back there. So again, return of the herd. Some animals are easier to herd than others, but that's what people have been doing for a long time. Okay, another livestock drive still in the early 20th century. Okay, so this is the basic von Thunen model. There could be a mathematical exposition of it. But even though it describes life as it was 200 years ago and is no longer relevant today, it at least gives you a sense of how economic forces, voluntary exchange, will all over the world result in fairly similar outcomes. There's a reason why some lands are devoted to certain uses as opposed to others, and there is a logic behind that. Okay, but again, I was telling you that von Thunen assumes a flat plane, assumes that people are sort of perfectly rational, assumes that transportation costs increase with the distance. But of course, the world is more complex, and as I was telling you at the beginning, some types of soil are better than others. Some parts of the world receive more or less rain than others. Some get more sunlight than others. And so there are other complications that you can introduce to sort of show that his model is an okay starting point to think in a general fashion about these things. But obviously the world is more complicated. So if you were masochistic enough to try to tinker with the von Thunen model, you would have the perfect rings. The perfect rings or the perfect bells here, no complexity, but if you want to introduce them, well, obviously then the model is no longer a description of reality, but it's more of a way to help you think about those problems. That's another one here. So you introduce a river, for example, a subcenter, all sorts of complications can be introduced, but again, you at least get a sense of the general idea. So the model modified by a river, so obviously in those days rivers were essential to move stuff around. We'll change land use. Okay, declines in transportation cost. So again, people today don't realize how difficult it was to move things overland until maybe a century ago. And that's because you take road pavement for granted. But road pavement only became widespread with the car in the early 20th century. Um, for most of the year, in most places, moving goods overland was very difficult. People could move, horses could move, you could move animals, again, goats, beef cattle, these kinds of things. But moving anything heavy on land was extremely difficult. There'd be holes, there'd be mud, and so you had to be highly motivated. So what you have here is the French army under Napoleon retreating from Russia. And they're actually moving heavy goods on land, but you can see how much fun that is. But obviously they're very motivated not to abandon their cannons to Russian forces. But if you look, for example, of heavy stuff being moved on land historically, you don't find many. Trust me, I looked around long. It took me a long time to find a picture like that because people were simply not moving goods over land all that much in the past. It was just too costly to do so, which is why historically the kind of stuff that you would find in, let's say, in caravans on the Silk Road would be things like gold, jewelry, silk, things that are extremely valuable and easy to move around. But heavy goods, and think of several bags of grains, for example, would not travel well over land. Now, water transportation was another thing, though. Boats could be of a certain size, they float on water, and so historically, large-scale transportation either required a navigable river, people building canals if you were over land, or else people having seagoing ships to cover long distances and carrying a lot of cargo with them. Now, in terms of moving things over oceans, though, the problems that you had in the age of sail is that you had to deal with ocean currents and wind patterns. So if you want to navigate over the Atlantic, you've got maritime currents that, because of the Earth's rotation, go that way. So if you want to go from Europe to New York in the age of sail, typically what you do, if you want to leave, let's say, Spain or perhaps even London, you don't really cross the North Atlantic that way. What you do is that you go south, and then eventually you come back up north. And you're very limited in terms of where you can go often and economically when you have to deal with ocean currents and wind patterns. So again, most of the traffic in those days followed these directions because this is what nature gave you. And if all you have is a wooden boat with a few sails on it, you're kind of limited in terms of what you can do. Okay, and then everything changes. So again, to give you a sense of what a game changer the railroad was, of course, railroad required a lot of infrastructure, but people had an incentive to build rails and the structure underneath it because for the first time in human history, the railroad makes moving a lot of heavy goods over long distances profitable. So this is a painting from the 19th century that tries to convey this idea. So you have your typical mud road. You can see your farmer with maybe, I don't know, a few barrels of apples and whatever else he's carrying, struggling with his horses over a mud road, while at the same time he's being passed by a railroad carrying a lot more goods, a lot faster, a lot more reliably. Now, what happens then is that Van Thunen becomes irrelevant because you can even move animals over long distances. And one problem with moving animals from the outer ring to the city is that they would go through wheat fields, they would go through orchards. And if animals are hungry, well, they will do a lot of damage. And at the same time, if you walk them over the long distances, they will lose in value because they will lose weight. And they will lose fat, and you'll just get a lesser price. So even with the railroad, it becomes even profitable to ship animals who used to walk by themselves historically. So New Orleans here. And in the late 19th century, the big fad is not food produced locally, but it's food produced much further away. And the argument is that, well, why would you satisfy yourself with crappy local products when you can get, for example, the best cranberries in the world from the Boston area? And so you've got something called long distance brand here saying to people, well, just consume the best, don't limit yourselves to what can be produced locally. Okay, steamships At first, they both have steam and sails, but eventually steam engines become efficient enough that people get rid of sails on ships. They're made out of steel, not out of wood, so they can be a lot bigger and they can move over much longer distances. But again, see, as late as the 1890s, if you want to send a steamship from England to New Zealand, it still makes sense to take advantage of the wind, because when you can do that, you don't need to consume coal. But eventually, again, steam engines become so efficient that people will get rid of those sails. But what people are doing here is that for the first time in human history, or at least a few years before, refrigeration units have been created. And so you can actually slaughter animals in places like New Zealand, freeze them, and ship them to a place like England. And so again, von Thunen becomes less and less relevant at the time. So this is what a cargo ship used to look like in those days. What you have here is a map that illustrates the changes in terms of where you can go with the advance of steamships. So the sail ship routes in white were the only ones that were profitable when you had to depend on, again, wind patterns and ocean currents. But when you have a steamship with a propeller, you can go anywhere, anytime, and you don't care about the wind, and your engine is strong enough to go against the current. And so suddenly a bunch of locations that were not profitable before or were too difficult to navigate to open up. And the world becomes really truly globalized for the first time in the late 19th century. Now today, of course, most goods move into containers, and so you can move the container from a boat to a truck to a train fairly easily, and so we move a lot more stuff a lot more efficiently and cheaply than in the past. Okay, so I've been telling you about environmental differences that affect the original von Thunen model, declines in transportation cost. Technologies also matter. So historically, people tried to preserve food in the absence of refrigeration in various ways. You can ferment things, so you can keep beer for a long period of time. You can keep wine for a long period of time. You can dry some food, so you can dry pork, for example. You can dry a ham and keep it for a long period of time. You can smoke meat, you can salt meat, you can pickle meat. But in the 19th century, things like canning and refrigeration appear, and again, it allows you to keep some types of food for a much longer period of time than in the past. So Nicolas Appert is the man who sort of invents canning, although at first he was using glass jars. And again, if you want to know the history beyond that, so if I told you the French army retreating from Russia, well, his incentive is Napoleon saying, well, I'll give a lot of money to someone who can help me preserve food over long distances. And what Napoleon really wants to do is to invade Russia. So anyway, the motivation might not have been the best one at first, although a lot of people had thought of ways to preserve food before. But what Appert does is that for the first time, he's able to put things like asparagus in jars. And people can consume green asparagus several months after they've been harvested. Now, you might not be fans of canned food today. We expect fresh food year-round, but in those days it was viewed as a big breakthrough. And eating something like canned asparagus in the winter was viewed as a huge progress as compared to what existed before. So Monsieur Appert found the art of fixing season. He makes spring, summer, and fall live in bottles. Again, today, for us, so what? But in those days, it was a big deal. Okay, mechanical refrigeration comes along, compressed ammonia technology. Today we have refrigerated containers. They're typically white. They have a refrigerating unit in the back. You can plug them on the cargo power source, on the cargo ship power source, a big diesel engine. That's why we can move fresh stuff year-round. And this is why we have fresh produce in our supermarkets in the winter. Okay, other technologies that made farming more profitable over time, that defeated other problems that people had to deal with in the past. So we use plastic to a much larger extent than in the past today. So remember those glass cloches before? Well, today the glass cloches are gone, but we use a lot of plastic instead in many places. So you can have, for example, here those row covers in plastic which essentially allow you to grow stuff in places where it wouldn't grow or not for the same length of time or not as productively. Okay, so if you ever travel to Europe and you consume stuff from Spain, if you happen to be in the Netherlands or in England, chances are that it comes from and I apologize for my Spanish, some of you can correct me later, the Costa del Politin, the Sea of Plastic. So these are all kind of cheap greenhouses that are built along the Mediterranean coast. So there's one part of Spain where you find a lot of greenhouses. Now the advantage there is that this part of Spain historically did not produce that much in terms of produce, and that's because it's very dry and very windy. But if you build even non-heated greenhouses, you do protect your produce from the wind and from the sun, and at the same time you retain more moisture around your vegetables, therefore increasing the productivity of your operation significantly. Okay, please remember this. This is your professor's equation to explain ever greater regional specialization of food production over time. So what you had historically were obviously differences in physical geography between locations. So again, more or less rain, more or less sunshine, soil quality, the latitude at which you're at. And then as economies develop, as I've been telling you too often this semester, you see the emergence of cities, large concentrations of people. This was never avoided. And you've got significant innovations in both the transport and the food preservation sector. So conservation might not necessarily be the right word, maybe I should repeat that here, but it's really food preservation, the way you can preserve food over time. So you've got those three factors, and the result is obviously ever greater regional specialization of food production the world over. Okay. So again, forget the world, look at the United States. So you've got low-lying areas in the east, often with very good soil. Then you've got the Appalachians and Allegheny Mountains, rock, not very good quality soil to grow stuff. Then you've got the Midwest, fairly flat, thick layer of good topsoil. The Mississippi Delta here, kind of flat, good for growing a few things. You move out west, you go up in altitude, so you've got a big plateau here, which is very dry, New Mexico. But you still have parts of New Mexico which specialize in growing peppers or a few crops that do well in that environment. And then you've got the West Coast, which has a lot of rain in a few places, like the Central Valley in California, which is, again, fairly flat, good quality soil, good environment to grow produce, among other things. And you've got more arid regions in the United States where you can have beef cattle, for example. Okay, so annual average precipitation in the United States, so forget the topography. In this case, it's just the amount of rain that each region receives. Very little rain in the west, a lot of rain here, a lot of rain here, a lot of rain in this area here. So again, different types of soil, different types of topography, different significant differences in terms of annual precipitation. Then you've got different climates. Obviously, the further north you go, the colder it gets. Further south you go, the more tropical it gets. The southern tip of Florida here. And then again, with economic development, people leave the countryside and move into cities. So you've got urban markets. Again, Boston to Washington in the east. Chicago, Milwaukee, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Houston, Dallas, Minneapolis. So historically, the railroad evolved in symbiosis with the emergence of cities. Now, Chicago was and remains to this day the main node of the railroad network in the United States. This is Omaha, Nebraska, a city that is not otherwise all that significant, but, oh, I'm sorry, no, this is Kansas City, much more significant. I'm sorry, Omaha would be here, so that would be Kansas City. Then, as the car came along, the interstate highway system, among other things, was built, and so the highways reached areas that were not always well served by the railroad, but they introduced more flexibility too, even though the cost of moving some units is more expensive than others. So again, you've got Kansas City out here, as I was telling you about, Chicago up here. So moving things by trucks is more expensive, but it's more flexible than the railroad, and so it often makes sense for shorter distances to move things off the rail, put it on trucks, and deliver it in the local area. And so the result is that even before trucking becomes significant, people abandon subsistence farming in the United States. People stop producing mostly for themselves and specialize in what they can do best and ship that stuff to cities. So in the north, so not too far from us, you have dairying and mixed farming. Then you've got the corn belt at the time. People used to grow, the corn belt has expanded today, but spring wheat, grazing and irrigated crops, subtropical crops, cotton, corn and winter wheat. Of course, if you take a finer look or a more detailed look within each region, you will find that the cotton belt really has a few spots that are a lot more productive than others. Farm regions today, you can see that the corn belt has actually grown over the last few decades. But other than that, it's hard to defeat nature and transportation. So regions have for a while settled into certain types of production that are best suited to local conditions. Okay, so this is from your textbook, the commodities that are the most traded the world over. This is 2011, so things like soybean, wheat, palm oil, and maize. The major commodity exporters, so the United States has a lot of people, but it does export a lot of stuff. So soybean, maize, which is corn, wheat, cotton, and things like that. Major commodity importers. China, as I showed you, has very good agricultural production conditions, but they also have a lot of people, so they need to supplement their own local production, especially as their citizens become wealthier and want a more diversified diet. So China, for example, imports a lot of soybean, and also it should be in there a lot of corn from the United States, well, if it's not important enough. But what they do is that instead of feeding it to people, they typically feed it to their chickens and their pigs, and people in China will be able to eat more meat that way. But it's not because they're able to feed all their animals by themselves, it's because they import a lot of soybeans from Brazil, Argentina, and the United States. Again, feed them to their chickens and their pigs, and they eat the meat as a result. Okay, any questions so far? So there was, again, a basic model in von Thunen's days. You could already have introduced some real-world considerations and relax some assumptions, but at least it helps you understand why things locate the way they do and why there is a logic to agricultural production. And over time, this sort of basic logic has been applied to the rest of the world with advances in transportation, in food preservation technology, and with the advent of urbanization. Okay, now the authors then discuss the issue of food security. So again, this is a topic that I discuss in more detail in my real food course, but just to give you a sense of what it is that they're dealing with. I don't know about your personal histories. I suspect that not many of you have really been hungry in your life. I mean, maybe sometimes you've had to skip a meal. Perhaps being a student is not always fun, but by and large, most of you have always had sufficient access to calories and vitamins and proteins to lead a reasonably healthy lifestyle. But this was not the rule historically. Most people were hungry most of the time in most places. And it is still true today for perhaps 1 billion or 2 billion people. So people are deemed food insecure when they have a problem accessing, again, sufficient nutrition. But it is paradoxically primarily a problem when people try to feed themselves. You want to look for a country where people are hungry? Well, look at a country where most people are still farmers. You want to find a country where people are obese and probably eat too much? Look for a country where maybe 2 or 3% of the population is farming. Why is that? Well, again, it's a matter of being a jack of all trades versus specializing in what you do best and trading with other people. Subsistence farmers the world over don't have access to modern technologies. They don't have access always to productive soil. They might not have access to fertilizers, to pesticides, to herbicides. And despite their hard work, they typically struggle to feed themselves well, because on top of not being so productive to begin with, they're more subject to, they're more likely to be affected negatively by things like droughts, floods, earthquakes, and things like that. So there are a number of problems related to food security today. Some are environmental, population pressures, war, diseases, corruption. But really what I want to focus on in this course in this lecture, are factors that are more specifically related to geographies. Now there are two ways to look at this. You can look at it the way the authors do, and they say, well, the way to achieve greater food security is to have people produce more of their own food. And then you've got people like me who believe, no, the solution to food security is to allow people to have access to plenty of food produced in other parts of the world that might be better suited for producing those foods than your local conditions. So the authors don't quote him, but in a way they kind of share the perspective of Mark Bittman, so you might be familiar with him. He's a guy who used to write recipes, but then delved into food policy, got tired of telling other people what to eat, and then decided to look into food policy. A quote from him in 2011, "I'm not a jingoist, but I'd prefer that more of my food came from America. It'd be even better, really, if most of it came from within a few hundred miles of where we live. We would be more secure." And that's the kind of perspective that sort of permeates the textbook. Now, why would that be? I'll ask you to remember those three things. So, why did historically people believe that people would be more food secure if more food was produced locally? Well, this is less of a concern today. You don't really expect to go through that, but the possibility of war was much more significant in the past. And so what would happen is that if you become dependent on other people to feed you, and you go at war either with those people or with another power that has the capacity to block your access to food produced elsewhere, then you have a major problem. And this is what happened, for example, in Germany during the First World War. I'll revisit that in a few slides. But essentially what happened is that the Germans had a really powerful army on land. But on the sea, they were no match for the British Empire. And so what happened in the 19th century was that Germany opened up to the world trade, in grain especially, and they did pretty much what the thing that the Chinese are doing today. So they imported a lot of animal feed for their pigs, for their dairy cows, for their beef cattle. And so as a result, more meat, more eggs, more high quality proteins, but also more animal manure became available to German consumers and German farmers. And so food production in Germany, because of international trade, became much more productive. On the one hand, people could afford to eat more milk, to drink more milk, eat more meat, eat more eggs than in the past. And because you had more animal agriculture, farmers had access to more manure, more fertilizers for their fields. But what happens in the First World War? Well, the British essentially cut the supply of foreign animal feed to Germany, and suddenly the Germans have a huge problem. Okay, you can kill your animals, but even if you kill them, then you don't have access to all the fertilizer that you had before. And so you have less food for the food that you want to eat. And try as you might, often animal agriculture takes place on land that is not really suitable to grow other types of crops. And so what you have here is a red line in Germany during the First World War, and the goal of the British at the time was to basically starve the Germans into submission. And to a large extent that worked. There were severe food shortages during the First World War in Germany, which a country like France, for example, because it was still supplied from the outside world, did not suffer with. Now, mind you, this later paved the way to Hitler and his notion of producing more local food for Germans, but that's another story. A second argument is that putting all your eggs in one basket, let's say producing wheat over large areas of land can be a problem. What if you've got a disease that affects your wheat, then you've got nothing else to fall back on, so it would be better to have a more diversified food system around you. So if you lose your wheat or your potatoes, you at least have something else to fall back on. And the third argument is that, again, if you specialize in what you do best and you trade with each other, that's great as long as you're competitive, but what if you specialize in the production of, I don't know, electric typewriters, and then the personal computer comes along? In that case, you don't even have the money to buy the food that is produced in other locations. So at least if you produce food locally, you always have something to fall back on. Okay, so as I see it, this is again going to be one of your, according to your professor, why did people historically promote greater local food production than would have been the case in a free market? I want to see those considerations. But the problem with those arguments, I would argue, is that they tend to forget a few problems that led to people being willing to become part of the global division of labor as far as food production is concerned. And the first is that historically people had to deal with a number of problems that would, for example, affect your food system, whether it was specialized or not. So let's say you have a drought, and a severe one. Doesn't matter how diversified your local food system is. You know, if you don't have enough water for your potatoes, your wheat, your apples, diversity doesn't help you in the case of a drought. Same is true if it's unseasonally cold or wet. Most of your crops won't survive. You might have floods. You might have pests that get out of control that will eat a lot of different things. It's very rare that, let's say, I don't know, pests will be limited to one type of crop. And you might have epidemics. Historically, the problem was you might have epidemics that might either kill the farmers or else kill their beasts of burdens. And again, it didn't matter how specialized you were, how diversified you were. If you lose the equivalent of your tractor before the tractor is invented, then you have a big problem. So all I would want here is a generalized abiotic or biotic stress. So either, you know, rain, wind, whatever, or diseases of various kinds. So I've mentioned this in one of my other courses this semester, but this is cattle plague or rinderpest as it is known. Killed all the livestock in southern Africa in the early 20th century. Not just the beef cattle, but also the goats, the sheep, a lot of wild animals that wore hoofs at the time. So, you know, bad things can happen, and a disease is rarely limited to one specific type of animal or plants. So again, you can have insects that eat everything in their path. Floods don't discriminate, floods don't care how diversified your local food system is. frost. And so basically, what people who say you should invest more in local food production and shun, or at least try to break your dependency towards world food markets, is that they're basically telling you to put all your agricultural eggs in one local basket. And again, these are serious problems. So a military blockade can be a problem, yes, but a local drought or a local flood can also be a problem. Okay, so what did people do again before the age of the railroad and the steamships? And I will ask you to remember a few of these things. I suggest you write everything down, and I might ask you 2 or 3 of those. Well, the reason why subsistence farmers the world over are not so productive is that, again, they have to be jack of all trades for food security consideration. It doesn't make sense if you cannot trade your food surplus to specialize in what you do best. If you produce for yourself, well then you need to have a diversified farm or food system, call it what you will, because again, if your chicken die, well, you're also growing potatoes, or if your corn suffers from a frost, well, you might have a pig to fall back on. So when you cannot trade, it makes sense if you're a subsistence farmer for food security consideration to avoid specialization. But again, the problem when you cannot specialize is that you're not very productive, jack of all trade, master of none. Now, another thing that people did historically when the topography made that possible was that land ownership in most subsistence farming communities that are not in a flat plain will not be contiguous. And what I mean by that is that historically, let's say, farmers who live, let's say, by the sea, but in a region that has hills, for example, might cultivate a patch of land at sea level, then another one on a hill somewhere. So they will own different patches of land in different microclimates within their immediate proximity. And again, that's because if you have, I don't know, a hailstorm that comes along, well, perhaps the hail will not affect one side of a hill as much as another. So it makes sense to own different small patches of land when the topography is different, or when the topography is varied in one regions. And again, that's not a great system, but at least it introduces some measure of security. Think of it as an insurance policy that otherwise would not exist. So historically, again, when you've got subsistence farming and a diverse topography, people used to own different patches of land, different parts of the environment. Then people historically also would store food for several months. So a common complaint today, if you read about food policy, is to say that, well, if somehow Toronto cuts its access to the Canadian or international food system, we would only have enough food in the city to survive for a few days, which is true. But the reason why the system is like that is because we have access to food from other parts of the world. But when you're kind of self-sufficient, you need to store food for several months to survive the quote-unquote hunger gap that you have between harvests. And so, for example, if you read medieval texts written in places like, I don't know, France or England, what is the season that people fear the most? It's not winter, it's spring. And why is that? Well, because winter follows the harvest. People are usually able to store enough food to survive the winter. But then spring comes, and it takes a while for new stuff to emerge and be ready to eat. And so in England, for example, in the Middle Ages, the month that people really fear is the month of May. You know, you think of the month of May today, you might think of Paris in the month of May, and you know, all the trees are in flowers, and you see buds, and it looks wonderful to us. Yeah, well, if you live in a subsistence farming community in the Middle Ages, you can't eat the goddamn buds. And you've probably eaten pretty much of all that you've managed to store to survive the winter. And so April and May are not months that people in medieval Europe look forward to. Okay, then you've got catch-up crops. So you typically want to grow a crop that produces the most, that tastes the best, and what have you. So in many places in southern Europe, things like winter wheat, it's called winter wheat because you plant it in the fall and it will grow the next year. But what if the wheat raises itself from the ground and you've got frost that kills everything? Well, one historical strategy was to grow things that are not as interesting as wheat, but that will grow faster. And these are known as catch-up crops. So millet, buckwheat, things that don't taste as good, things that are not as productive, but things that have the advantage of growing a lot more quickly. So at least you can have catch-up crops. And then the ultimate recourse is famine food. And by this I don't mean eating your children, although obviously, in some desperate parts of the world, people would do that. But things that are usually not eaten in some cultures. So let's say, I don't know, there's a zombie apocalypse tomorrow and there's suddenly nothing left to eat in our supermarkets. Well, suddenly those crows or those seagulls, forget the Canadian goose because obviously they would be the first to go, but things that you don't consider eating would suddenly become a lot more attractive. And so again, in the past, in places like Europe, foxes, crows, frogs in cultures that don't eat them, tree bark, certain types of tree barks would be eaten. You could cut down grass, make a soup out of it. Stuff like that. Now what you have here is a picture of real mud pies being made in Haiti. Now obviously you don't just collect any clay from a dirt road, you go collect the best clay deposits. And you add anything else that you have, vegetable shortening, salt, sugar, butter. The thing about clay is that it won't kill you. It will fill your stomach and it won't kill you. It's not nutritious. But at least it fills your stomach and you can add a few things to it if you have access to them. So you've got to be really desperate to eat this stuff, but this is what people used to do historically. Okay, so worldwide again, there's a website that has compiled the kind of stuff that people were to eat when they were really desperate. So of course human flesh, but also leather. So at some point your belt or your shoes might come in handy. Fungi, seaweeds, nettle, frogs, and rats in Hawaii, weeds, ferns, roots, sweetened the inner bark of birch and straw. I don't know about you, but when I went to summer camp when I was a kid, I had to eat birch bark. You don't eat the outer layer, you don't eat the inner layer, you eat the one in between. That was introduced to us as famine food. If you're lost in the wood and there's nothing else. Then famine food for livestock. At one point in time, people used to have thatch roof, among other things. So you can see here Russian peasants trying to feed their starving animals because maybe there's been a drought and there's nothing else to eat at this point. You can write this down, infanticides and illicides. So in many cultures, you kill either the very small, you kill either the very young or the very old. So very old have had their run. The kids are not productive enough, and chances are they won't survive anyway. So if you remember the Hansel and Gretel story, I won't get into the details here, but obviously, in places like Germany, you have a famine, you're short on food, what do? Well, you take your kids to the woods, you abandon them, and you wish them good luck. I mean, that's why you had stories like Hansel and Gretel. Okay, so what happens then? How is historically famine defeated? Why is it that most of us never think of famine. Well, it's interesting to see where famine was first defeated. And the two places where this first happens are the Netherlands and England. Why is that? Well, because in the age of sail, they're the two countries with the best fleets and the best sailors. And so whenever there's a food shortage in the Netherlands or in England, because any part of these countries is not really far from the sea, it is possible to dispatch people to find food elsewhere and bring it back to those countries. And so again, for the first time in human history, even in advanced places like France or China, you still have recurring famines because they're mostly land powers. The countries that are the most heavily involved in the maritime trade and have the best ships are the first one to defeat famine. And as the demand for food in places like the Netherlands and England increases, people who can be reached through maritime transportation have an incentive to specialize in what they do best and export, because they know that not only will they be able to find a market in places like the Netherlands and England, but also that these ships can bring them other types of food and other types of goods. So again, let's go back to the three reasons I've already discussed with you. So the same picture, the same worries. You don't need to write this down again. What about strategies that are promoted today, like food sovereignty, that believe that food security is better achieved by keeping and developing local agriculture at the expense of international trade? Well, in a way, you could argue that food sovereignty has been tried before, a number of times. So again, Napoleon, the third time I mentioned him today, so if you didn't know what he looked like. So basically what Napoleon does, you've got the French Revolution, that opens the road to power to someone who would have never had that opportunity before, and that's a fellow born in Corsica, which is that island here. Historically would have likely been an Italian, but for political reason is born French. Military genius, is able to conquer most of Europe, except for Ireland and the United Kingdom and Portugal. And so what he does is that he closes Europe to international trade, and he tries to develop local substitutes. So Europe at that point in time has become very dependent on sugar produced in tropical locations, but the sugar is produced from sugar cane. Napoleon, again through financial incentive, is able to promote the cultivation of a substitute, which is sugar beet, which is more expensive, not as productive, but can be produced in Europe. But the result, of course, is that people pay more for their food and have access to a less diverse array of goods than would have been the case before. Now, military blockade, this is another one that took place during the American Civil War in the early 1860s. So this, the North at the time essentially controls the Navy, and they try to blockade the South. People try to increase local food production, but obviously they cannot have the same standard of living than when they had access to cheaper goods elsewhere. I've already told you about the naval blockade of Germany during the First World War. And again, the reason why the British, the reason why the Union Army in the United States, and the reason why Napoleon wants to isolate Great Britain is not because he wants to promote a more sustainable local food supply. The reason why people blockade those other countries is because they know that they'll be worse off if they have to produce their own food than if they have access to food from other locations. Okay, the argument in favor of monocultures. So again, a lot of local food activists will tell you that having a more diverse local food production will be more resilient. You'll have more stable communities. You won't have to deal with, this is the grape phylloxera, so this is an insect that attacks grapevines in Western Europe and the United States in the late 19th, early 20th century, if memory serves. the Irish potato famine in Ireland. So um, the economic monoculture argument that I've told you. So I know that some of you are from India. I don't know how familiar you are with the history of your country, but one of the reasons why Gandhi emerges as a leader is that in the early 20th century, German chemical firms developed synthetic substitutes to natural dyes like indigo. So indigo was extracted from a plant. The reason why your jeans are blue is that because historically the cotton was dyed with indigo. Some regions of India specialize in this. There's a lucrative market, but suddenly the Germans come along and they're able to produce synthetic dyes that are just as good for 10% of the price. And so significant regions of India suffer economic hardship at the time, and Gandhi is a lawyer that pleads the case of some of these regions. And so again, they had done what people there in Bihar and other parts of India had done what they had been told: specialize in what you do best, trade with the rest of the world. Synthetic dyes come along, you're kind of screwed locally. So what are the solutions? Well, today what a lot of people are promoting is polyculture, which I think is fair to characterize as the approach of subsistence agriculture, but with modern technologies. So, electric fencing, fertilizers, grow lights, stuff like that. But again, if history teaches you something, is that there is a downside to all of that. So historically, Greece emerged in terms of its early civilization because it was a network of polis, of independent cities that traded a lot. Maritime trade was very easy, at least by historical standards, in the Aegean Sea, among other things. But as Athens becomes something of an imperial power, they increasingly have to invade other cities and subjugate other territories because Athens is not a great place to grow food. But what every empire tends to do, or what every military dictatorship tends to do, is to promote self-sufficiency, and this always leads to people invading other territories because there's only so much you can produce in a place like Attica here, which is where Athens is located. So throughout the 20th century, people who have promoted shunning international trade and promoting local food include people like Mussolini in Italy in the 1920s, Nicolae Ceausescu, a communist dictator in Romania. The Soviet Union at one point wants to stop importing grain from other locations. So again, Mussolini in Italy wants to break what he calls the slavery of Italy's dependence on imports of grain from places like Hungary and the United States. So that's Mussolini here, the Italian dictator, trying to promote wheat production. But what happens, of course, is that Italy is not a great place to produce wheat. It's very good to produce citrus fruits, it's very good to produce olives and a few other things. But even in Roman times, most of the grain that was consumed in what is now Italy had to come from some other location because Italy just does not have very good growing conditions. So what happens in Italy? Well, they increase wheat production, but obviously you cannot grow wheat in the mountains. So what goes? Well, again, citrus fruits, olive groves, and other things like that. So Italians pay more for their bread and have a less diverse diet. Again, there's a reason why people specialize in what they do best and trade with each other. And there is a cost if you back away from that. Okay, so the case against local food, I'm not really going to quiz you on that, but what happens historically when you have wars is that you can, if you see it coming especially, you can sort of ramp up local food production for a little while. So this is a poster from the United States here from the First World War, U.S. Department of Agriculture, 1917. Help feed yourself, make backyards and vacant lot productive, work a garden, raise chickens. And people do it. People essentially live up to the ideal of locavores or local food activists today. But then the war is over, and they stop producing food in their front yard and their backyard. This is a poster from World War II in England. In that case, the Germans have learned their lesson, and they basically want to do to the British what was done to them in the First World War. So what do? Well, they dispatch a lot of submarines, U-boats, to sink ships that are bringing food to England. And so the poster here tells you, well, use spades, produce more of your own food rather than depend on food that is being shipped to you by the Americas because of those wolf packs of U-boats in the North Atlantic. So again, this is not a recent locavore, local food poster. This is a World War II propaganda poster from the United Kingdom. And you can see your average British citizen growing cabbage, having bees, keeping a goat, having ducks, rabbits, chickens. So Dig for Victory was the title of the campaign at the time. But the thing about all those campaigns is that you can ramp up food production for a while, but then the war is over and people give up right away. And why is that? Well, because, again, producing food that way is expensive, and unless you do it as a hobby, it doesn't make sense to try to produce your own food when you can go to the supermarket and get things that are probably just as good and probably even better for a fraction of the price. So during World War I and World War II, people from the United States to England to Japan to Germany produced more food on their own, but as soon as global markets reopened, people do something else with their times. They get an extra job, they enjoy their lives a little bit more, they pick up other hobbies, but these things never last. Okay, other problems with autarky and polycultures in the past, I'm not gonna tell you, I'm not gonna quiz you on that, but this is a big granary that was built in France before the French Revolution. The problem is that historically storing food was always resulting in a lot of local corruption. Whoever was put in charge always had an incentive to sort of mismanage the thing and grease their own pockets that way. The productivity, again, if you try to produce food in less than ideal conditions, your productivity is lower. And again, generalist problems don't go away, whether pests or diseases. So India today still has a grain reserve. This is from Punjab here, as you can see. And anyone who studies that with a measure of objectivity will tell you that it's badly managed. Bureaucrats don't care really how well their things are managed, and then there's a significant damage. I mean, keeping grain also requires, fumigating it from time to time. So killing pests, make sure that there's some air circulation and what have you. So the problems that you see in a place like India today that still has a food storage policy are the same that you saw everywhere else historically. Then you've got economic and environmental costs. I've mentioned the nutritional costs. If you pay more for your food and you have less variety, the people's diet is less interesting over time. In terms of environment, well, if you have less suitable land, you need to cultivate more of it to produce the same amount of food. So you actually encroach more on nature if you want to produce local food than if you allow people to, again, produce food in the best locations the world over. So other examples of what happened historically in the United Kingdom and other places during the First and the Second World War, well, what happens? Well, people get rid of grassland and orchards. If you have a choice between producing apples or producing potatoes, you go for potatoes because you get a lot more calories on the same piece of land. You get rid of beef cattle, so again, cattle that is produced for its food, and you try to produce dairy cattle instead because you'll get more nutrition. You get rid of the chicken and the pigs because, like humans, they need to consume grains, whereas goats, sheep, and cows can survive on stuff that humans cannot digest. And you eliminate luxury animals. So the dog population in the United Kingdom in the Second World War, for example, went down significantly. Because when the going is tough, if you have a choice between feeding your kids or feeding your dog, especially if you've got more than one dog, well, the dogs will go. So what people realize historically is that there is safety in numbers. You have on the one end the choice of depending on your local farmers, who are certainly well-intentioned and might want to help feed their neighbors, but The alternative is not one food producer elsewhere, but a bunch of food producers in diverse locations, different countries, different sovereign units, and so not everyone is likely to stop feeding you at the same time. Okay, so this is a quote from someone who lives in what is now inland Turkey, almost 2,000 years ago. There was a famine, the most severe within the memory of man. The city was in distress, but there was no help forthcoming. The maritime cities support without difficulty occasions of want like these, but we in the inland can make no profit on our superfluous products. So selling our fancy furniture, selling our jewelry, selling our fancy textiles, nor procure what we need, having no means of disposing of what we have and importing what we lack. So if you're a maritime city, even 2,000 years ago, the odds, in peacetime anyway, of having a local famine are almost nil. If you live inland where land transportation sucks, and you've got a local problem with your crops or your harvest, you suffer a lot more. 1768, Nicolas Baudot, another French ecclesiast, but also economist, les accidents se compensent entre les royaumes, so shocks cancel one another across kingdoms. So basically what he's telling you is that when you have an international food system, some people will have bumper crops, other people will have bad harvests, some people will have a healthy flock one year, other people might have animal diseases. But in the long run, surplus, shortages will equal each other over the long run. So it might be that a region that has a bumper crop one year will have a bad harvest the next year, but the region that has a bad harvest this year might have a bumper crop the following year. So as long as you've got trade and a transportation infrastructure, you can mitigate the risk by spreading it across ever larger areas. So famines historically were a reality in India before the British showed up. And so after an especially severe famine, what is the answer of the authorities there? Well, build more railroads. That fellow here, the author of the Annals of Rural Bengal, says, well, what prevents famine is every measure that helps towards the extension of commerce and the growth of capital, increases the facilities of transport and distributions, and renders each part of a country less dependent on itself. Again, spread the risk. Insurance 101, don't put all your eggs in one regional basket. So Cormac O'Grada, Irish economic historian, probably the foremost scholar of famine, at least historically considered today. The historical record suggests that the integration of markets and the gradual eradication of famine are linked. I mentioned briefly the Irish potato famine before, which occurred in between 1845 and 1849. The key lesson, if you look at the history of famine in Ireland, is that the more globalized Ireland became, the less subjected to famine it was. So most people have heard of the potato famine. What they don't know is that there was an even worse famine a century before in Ireland, where actually a lot less people were eating potatoes. And that's because you had extreme cold and rain in several years in a row. And if you grow barley, for example, or oats, people starved anyway. Potato culture was nowhere near as important as it was a century later. So there's even something called the Year of the Slaughter, where more Irish people died percentage-wise than would die during the potato famine a century later. Then fast forward to 3 decades after the Irish potato famine. At that point in time, you have many Irish people who have moved to either England or the United States. You've got steamships, you've got railroads. There's another quote-unquote mini-famine in Ireland. There's another failure of the potato crop. But what happens then? Well, again, you've got steamships, you've got railroad, you've got Irish people in England, you've got Irish people in the United States. They can send money to their relatives in Ireland, and their relatives can actually have enough money to pay for the trouble of delivering food to Ireland using steamships and railroad. And so some people got hungry that year, but it was nowhere near the catastrophe that the potato famine had been a few decades earlier, before the development of that transportation infrastructure. Okay, another counterfactual. The rinderpest in South Africa that I showed you before, well, you had the same problem in England in the 1860s, and you had roughly 350,000 heads of cattle that were lost in Great Britain. And yet nobody died because at that point again, Great Britain is thoroughly integrated into world markets, and so yes, they lose most of their cattle in the United Kingdom, but they can import meat and foodstuff from other locations the world over. So the truth about monocultures, I'm not going to quiz you on that, but at least try to remember this, especially if you believe that local food will make you more food secure. Nobody would specialize in one type of crop if they were not already part of a global division of labor, which relies on good transportation infrastructure. Never made sense historically. Subsistence farmers never specialized when without access to distant markets and decent transportation infrastructure. Now, people who produce one type of crop can rely on the whole world in other locations where people produce specialized crops too. So if you want to buy wheat today, you can buy wheat in Canada, the United States, you can buy wheat in France, you can buy wheat in Australia, in Argentina, many locations. So even if you're a wheat farmer in the United States and somehow you lose your crop one year, chances are you won't run out of bread, at least in your house, because you can always borrow money or sell your tractor or do whatever to allow you to buy wheat from other locations. So you're never alone when you're a monocultural producer, when you're part of a broader division of labor. And because you become more productive, you have the money and you have the incentive to finance the work of people like plant breeders or veterinarians and what have you, to make your crops ever more productive and resilient. Subsistence farmers don't have the money to sustain chicken breeding research or the development of rot-resistant wheat, for example. Bottom line, I would argue, is that diversified subsistence farmers have starved historically. Monocultural producers didn't, again, because they were part of that broader division of labor. And today, as in the past, when food aid is delivered, it's typically from monocultural producers to subsistence and therefore diversified farmers. In terms of economic over-specialization, well, what if you specialize in the production of electric typewriters? You can always migrate to other locations. You can try to produce something else. But most locations, like Toronto, actually have multiple profitable specialization. So if our car industry is suffering as it has in the last few years, well, there might be other job opportunities. Okay, this is the statue of a fellow that you will see if you ever go to Sydney, Australia. A prominent businessman who ended up losing his fortune not long before he died, but he was one of the pioneer of the frozen meat trade from Australia. So Australia and New Zealand at the time have many sheep. But what they export is wool, and that's why they have many sheep to begin with, because you can try to can sheep meat, but apparently it's not very good. But you have all this surplus meat in Australia and New Zealand, and you have people who are hungry in the United Kingdom. Again, remember, they had ridden their best not too long before, so they're more than receptive to importing meat from other locations. And what this fellow will do, although he won't succeed, is try to invest a lot of money in developing refrigeration techniques to move all that surplus meat from Australia to hungry people in Western Europe. And so what he writes in 1875, as he's pushing his scheme at the time has arrived when the various portions of the earth will each give forth their products for the use of each and of all, that the overabundance of one country will make up for the deficiency of another, the superabundance of the year of plenty serving for the scant harvest of its successor. Climate, seasons, plenty, scarcity, distance will all shake hands, and out of the commingling will come enough for all. And he says, well, you might think that life is unfair, but look at it this way. You have regions that have plenty of food, not many people. You have other regions that have many people, productive economies, not much food. But it is now possible to do something about it, which it wasn't before. And the result, he argues, is that a better division of labor, higher standards of living, less hungry people. Okay, it's kind of getting late. I'll finish these slides next week. So I still have a number of term tests and proposals. If you haven't done so, pick them already. I will again delete most of the questions from the first part in the coming days. And NIMBYs, not in my backyard, bananas don't build